Good evening and welcome to the San Francisco Public Library. I'm Joan Jasper and I'm with the Department of Exhibitions and Public Programs at the library. And I want to welcome you to our program tonight, our incredible evening with playwright and author Philip Kan Gotanda. And we want to thank the Friends of the San Francisco Public Library. We also want to thank ACT and, of course, Philip and Chloe Veltman for being part of this program tonight. This program is in connection with two exhibits that we have up on the 6th floor. The first one is called If They Came For Me Today, the Japanese American Internment Project. And also we have another exhibition called Relocation and Resiliency, the Japanese American Internment in California. And both of those are up on the 6th floor, and this is the last week. So if you haven't had a chance to see these exhibits yet, we really encourage you to go on up and see them because they'll be closing on Sunday. And we really want to thank Community Works for bringing the exhibit If They Came For Me Today to the San Francisco Public Library. And here to tell you a little bit more about Community Works is Ruth Morgan. So help me welcome Ruth Morgan. Thank you.
Thank you. I do hope that if you haven't seen the exhibit, you will go up to the Skylight Gallery and see it. The project actually involved over 225 young people who studied the Japanese internment through the personal stories of 15 people who were interned or impacted by the internment. And the exhibition highlights the individual stories of each of the Japanese Americans who came into the classroom, as well as the rich student responses to these stories. The project really gave the students space to make very meaningful connections between the historical event of the Japanese internment and contemporary and historical instances of social injustice in America today. But we're here today to meet Philip and Chloe, and so I want to introduce you to them. Philip also was one of the gracious Japanese Americans who came into the classroom and told his story. Philip Kan Gotanda went to law school and graduated Hastings Law School, but never actually practiced law. He became the first chronicler of the Japanese American experience and is credited with broadening the definition of theater by bringing Japanese American stories to stages all across the country. He has collaborated with the most diverse American theater venues, from large mainstream houses to the most experimental venues, to African American ethnically specific theaters, reaching extraordinarily diverse audiences. From here to Japan, his acclaimed Sisters Matsumoto premiered in Japan in 2005. In the last couple of years, he worked with Camposanto and Intersection of the Arts on A Fist of Roses, exploring male violence, and he wrote Manzanar, an American story about the Japanese American internment, an orchestral spoken word production in collaboration with maestro Ken Nagano of the Berkeley Symphony and the Berlin Philharmonic, and several very acclaimed composers. Many of his plays are collected in No More Cherry Blossoms, published by the University of Washington Press. Among his honors and awards are the Guggenheim, the NEA, the Rockefeller, the Pew Charitable Trust, the Civil Liberties Public Education Fund, and Lila Wallace Reader's Digest Award. And I could go on and on. Philip is also a respected independent filmmaker whose film recently premiered at Sundance. But we're here today to talk about his upcoming production, After the War, directed by Carrie Perloff at ACT. A jazz-infused drama set in post-war San Francisco, Japantown in 1948, and which chronicles the return of Japanese Americans from the internment camps. Sharing this evening is Chloe Veltman. Chloe was born in London, received a first-class bachelor's degree in English literature from King's College, Cambridge, her master's degree with distinction from the Central School of Speech and Drama in London, in conjunction with Harvard University and the Moscow Art Theater School. She has worked both as a staff reporter for the Daily Telegraph and as a freelance writer, her articles appearing on both sides of the Atlantic. She's the chief theater critic for the San Francisco Weekly, theater commentator for NPR affiliate KALW, and serves on the Glickman Theater Award panel prior to launching her career as a journalist. Chloe worked for several years in US and UK theater companies, including the American Repertory Theater. She is the recipient of the Alan Wright Award for Arts Journalism, the Sundance Institute Arts Writing Fellowship, and the NEA Columbia Graduate School of Journalism, Classical Music and Opera Institute Fellowships. In 2006, she received a Best Columnist nomination at the annual San Francisco Media Excellence Awards, and her first book, On Acting, was published by Farber and Farber in the UK and Farber Incorporated in the United States. Let's welcome Philip Kan Gotanda and Chloe Veltman. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you. Hi there, Philip.
Hi, Chloe. I hope this is, we didn't get a chance to do a mic test.
A mic test. I think, can everyone hear us okay? Yeah, loud and
Okay,
clear.
great.
So this play, it's been quite a journey. We're talking 3.5 years, maybe nearly 50 different drafts,
Yes,
and 5 workshops.
5 workshops, yes.
So looking back at the journey, how's it been for you, and has it come out as you expected it would?
Well, what's interesting is if you work on a play this long, normally there are times when it becomes redundant and you get a little bored with the piece. I mean, it's only natural. It's pushing actually 4 years now. And this one was interesting in that it never got boring or ever felt redundant. And each thing that we did over these almost 4 years, whether it was going out to Sundance or to a writer's retreat they have in Sheridan, Wyoming. Is that where you went? You said you were on a fellowship from Sundance?
Yeah, no, that was in Utah, at Sundance Village.
Oh, okay, you went. That's a great place.
And in LA as well, down there at the Institute.
Well, they have another writer's retreat in Sheridan, Wyoming, so I spent time out there, and we workshopped this in San Francisco. We've done readings out at the Asia Society in New York, and each time we did a workshop, each time we did a reading, it moved the piece forward. And I think in large part it has to do with working with Carrie Perloff, the director who runs ACT, but she's also an excellent dramaturg. And she worked very closely with me in terms of the writing of the material, so that as we went along, we were able to shape the piece as well as figure out how to stage it. It's an interesting piece in that I wrote it with a number of small scenes. And the choice is, you either present it like a dollhouse, or a rear view window where you have kind of a cutout and you kind of jump from one room to another. Or, and this was my preference, to develop some kind of cinematic approach, theatrical cinematic approach, to allow for there to be a fluidity in all these separate scenes. And so Carrie and the scenic designer, Don Leisman, as well as the lighting designer, Jim Ingalls, developed this concept of a turntable in which you'd have a set that would turn and would allow for us as an audience to kind of see primary locations, but then see beyond that through the set, secondary and tertiary sort of scenes, and that it would move so that there would be a fluidity of moment to moment, scene to scene, as opposed to it being very boxy. And so in the writing of the piece, all of this was taken into consideration while it was being developed, how we were going to stage it. And over that period of 3.5 to 4 years, the piece got tighter, stronger. We worked with a variety of actors that came and went, which in this particular case was very important because the material deals with people from a lot of different backgrounds. And my own background is Japanese American. There are 2 characters who are Japanese American, 3 rather. But there are African-American characters, there are Anglo-American characters, there's a Russian Jew by way of Yokohama, and I don't necessarily have those backgrounds. So in the workshop process, what it allows me to do is work with actors, in particular some of the African-American characters. I can work with them to make sure that the characters I'm developing have an authentic, authenticity to them, and that they're from the inside out as opposed to sort of working from the outside in. And so for me, those kinds of things are critical. So spent a great deal of time making sure that the characters that were wrought, that you'll ultimately see on stage, are truthful, are grounded in real life. So over this period of 3.5 to 4 years, it was time well spent, and it continues to be developed even as we speak. I'm going to go home and do some more rewriting after this, and so it's still being worked on.
So let's talk a little bit about the inspiration for the play. I mean, I've seen from reading different things about you that your productions or your plays have been inspired by very diverse things. I mean, for example, there's a play you're developing right now for the Asian American Theatre Company called, which is based on the sort of quite unpolitically correct Asian children's book, The Five Chinese Brothers, which it's a play that's going to be called Four Chinks and a Dyke. Yeah. And so that was inspired by that. And then there's I've read also that there's the Dream of Kitamura, which was apparently inspired by a dream that your father, that you had about your father. And then I read that this play, originally, way back, before it became this play, was going to be an adaptation of Akira Kurosawa's 1950 film Rashomon. But now, it's something very different now. So I'm wondering, where did the inspiration come from, and how did you get from Rashomon to this?
Well, the original idea was that I was going to do an adaptation of Rashomon, and I've always loved the film, and I love the writer, whose 2 short stories it was based upon, Akutagawa. And so Carrie Perloff said, "You want to write a play for us? How about adapting Rashomon?" And I said, "Sure, this is great." So I went away and started writing, and as is the case when I do this, sometimes I go in a straight line, and then sometimes I just end up somewhere totally different. And I've grown to accept it, that I'm going to follow the horse wherever it goes, and hope that the theater is comfortable with it. And so it started off as Rashomon, and I couldn't find an entree into it. When you do an adaptation, for me, I look at trying to frame it in the present day life context, or contextualize it in another historical moment and bring that kind of storyline, the skeletal structure of it into it. And I couldn't make any headway. And then a story that I had been floating around in my head kind of came to the fore. And as is the case when I write, there'll be storylines that are floating in my head for years. Years and years are just floating around in my head, waiting for a moment to sort of find its moment. And there had been this story that I had been working on off and on about this boarding house in San Francisco, post-internment camps. And as I worked on this Rashomon story, this other one kind of came alive, and they began to sort of meld, and they wrote themselves and became After the War. So when you see the play, you'll see elements of Rashomon in the play, but you'll have to look very closely. And to Carrie Perloff and ACT's credit, they were very cool about it, which is the great thing about working in theater as opposed to film. They said, "Fine, let's go with this. Let's run with it." And so once they were comfortable with it, we just continued to work on it for 3.5, 4 years now.
So the play takes this play that you've now written, that is developed from that seed idea, takes its theme Japanese internment camps and what happened to somebody who'd been in an internment camp. This character had not only been sent there, the central character in the play, but also he had said that he wasn't going to fight in the war. Perhaps you'd like to sort of talk a little bit about the theme of the play, but also the theme of internment camps is something that you've sort of visited well, quite a bit in your writing, Philip. Sister Matsumoto, for example, and then in the collaboration with Kent Nagano, Manzanar. And I know that this play is rather different, but this is a theme that you seem to come back to time and time again. Can you talk a little bit about that, please?
Well, I think, if you're Japanese American, it's one of those things that is just a part of your body. I mean, it's there no matter where you look or how fast you run or if you embrace it. It's simply there. And I was born post-war, post-internment camps in the 50s. And though it wasn't something that was talked about a lot at the time I was growing up, it certainly was always there. And as I grew older and I began to write, and I began to write about stories of my family, I began to realize that that particular historical moment, because it affected en masse a whole community, in my instance, all of Stockton, the whole Japanese American community was uprooted and ultimately ended up in Roar, Arkansas. And so if you live in that kind of a community that's gone through that, there is a kind of a common thread that runs through the psyche, the behavior of that community that you absorb, whether it's talked about overtly or not. And that's the world I grew up in. And so as I grew older and into the late 60s, when this whole movement began to sort of remember the event, where, quote, the younger Sansei went back to the Nisei and said, let's talk about this. I happened to be sort of around that time and participated in that particular kind of critical movement when this whole concept of Asian America came about, where there was an acknowledgement that these kinds of stories are important, they haven't been told, and we should tell them. And so for me, it's a time of when I began to ask my parents, I began to look around me, I began to research, and I found that there was all this, I don't know if this is a word, dimensionality to this story that's inside of me, that's all around me, and that has always been around me. So it's only natural that when I would pursue a story and just sit down and begin to write, one, it was natural that the characters would normally be Japanese American and or Asian American, and it would be natural that those events that happened that were seminal, this is like one of those core seminal events of a community that shapes everything from that point on, generation after generation, that they continue to sort of float up and become part of my storylines. Even when sometimes I try to not go in that direction, it would come up. And what I've even found is, as I write characters now, for example, in the play After the War, when I write characters that are not Japanese American, that are African American, that are Anglo-American, as in this particular play, I have to be really, really conscious of the fact that these characters and how they speak, and the directness of their speech, in how aggressive or non-aggressive they are in certain situations, that I'm seeing the world through that character's eyes and not my normal Japanese American sort of perspective, because my point of view, I've come to know, is a specific one. How my characters and how I talk to the world and interact with the world is very different than how other people's might. And so over the years, I've learned how to both be aware of my own particular voice and how I have to also look beyond it if I want to write about other characters who are not part of a lineage that has come from the internment camp experience. And so in a long way of telling and responding to the question, it's simply there inside of me. Mm-hmm. It's like part of your history. And so it's easy for me to write about it. The key is that if I write about it now, both in terms of me as an artist and just for the interest of the audience, I have to find a new way to explore it. I have to find some way that affords new information to the people and a new approach for me so it doesn't get boring. I mean, I've written about this stuff for 30 years, and, if you're an artist, the point is not to keep, for me anyway, to keep keep saying the same thing. The idea is that to keep on challenging yourself so that you're always on sort of the edge of your own knowledge, You're always on the edge of your art form, so that when you write, and you write about a theme such as the internment camps, and you've written about it before, you're always sort of exploring new ways to attack it, to approach it, so that it keeps its relevancy to today, and that it stays fresh and alive for the audience and for myself. So in After the War, it deals with post-internment, but a critical, and this is sort of where the origins of the story come from, and you were asking about that earlier, Chloe. One of the things that I've been interested in for the last, I'd say 10 years of my writing, is how different communities interact with other communities when they rub up against each other. It's just because that's so much of what being an American is this day and age. And you know, as I would hear people telling stories about San Francisco's Japantown, I began to come across this whole theme of, during the internment camps, Japanese Americans were interned. And so in this vacuum in Japantown, there was the Fillmore district with African Americans and a variety of other peoples, and they moved into the community. And then Japanese Americans get out of camp and they come back to their neighborhood that has been populated and made into a different life and different world. And what happens when those two communities overlap and intersect? You know, whose place is it? Whose home is it? Who's an American? How do we sort of coexist in this post-war period where the peoples in that community are by and large marginalized, and yet you have this whole kind of other thing happening where it's, the war has been won, you know, this is like new things, television is happening, advertisements, this whole advertising thing is happening. And so you have these marginalized peoples, and what happens? Is it possible to develop a kind of, at that moment, a cross-cultural community? I mean, is it possible to have kind of a multicultural community that emerged from that moment? And so, in particular, that's what I wanted to explore. And then part of the backdrop is there was this extraordinary jazz scene happening in that area. There's a wonderful book called Fillmore, Harlem West, and then also there's several other books that are about that particular era. But that's all happening too, where people like Billie Holiday, Count Basie, Duke Ellington, they were all playing right in San Francisco's Japantown and the Fillmore district, you know, Bop City, Plantation Club, Jack's Tavern. That's another world that I was intrigued by, and the fact that there were jazz, Nisei jazz musicians. And then also the issue of the No-No Boys, which I'm not sure if all of you are aware of. But one of the storylines in the play is about a character named Chet Monkawa, and he is what's called a no-no boy. And what they were historically, in the internment camps, at some point, everyone in the internment camps was asked to do this questionnaire. And there were two questions, questions 27 and 28, which basically said, you will forswear allegiance to Japan and the emperor, and that you will swear that allegiance to America, and that you will serve in the armed forces. And for young Nisei men, you know, in their late teens and 20s, if you signed that, by and large, the sense was you could be drafted. And what came about was a certain amount of controversy over those two questions, because a lot of things were floating around, and one of them was, you know, one of the arguments, and that's my character, you know, we're locked up, we're in prison, and then, you know, I'm asked to sort of go out and sort of like defend this country while we're all locked up, and on top of that, I'm supposed to like, you know, divorce myself from a allegiance to a foreign emperor that a country I've never been to, and I have to like swear that I'm an American when I thought I was always an American. And there was a great deal of controversy in the camps, and difference of opinion. And so my character is one of those individuals who signed no. That's a form of protest. And because of doing that, he is taken out of the camp that he's in and sent to Tule Lake, where most of the troublemakers, quote, troublemakers were sent. And then he gets out of camp, and then he comes back to San Francisco. And what happened in the Japanese American communities is that many of the young men signed yes, yes. Many of them went off to war and became part of the 442nd, the 100th Battalion, the MIS, Military Intelligence, yeah, MIS, and were extraordinarily heroic and died in very high casualty rates in Europe. And so when Chet Mokawa comes back to San Francisco, those people who signed no were looked upon as cowards. They were traitors. You know, they set out the war, whereas these other people died. Everyone had a friend, an uncle. I had an uncle or somebody they knew who had died, lost an arm, was killed in service. And so Chet comes back, and he is literally spit on by his own community. And so my protagonist is someone who's an ex-jazz musician, who's kind of spent his adult years playing with black groups. He comes back to San Francisco at a time when Japantown is still sort of like kind of unraveling from this sort of who lives here, who doesn't live here. And he wants to kind of find Japantown again, find his own sort of home, while at the same time, around him, his own community is looking at him as if he is a traitor. And so as he says, and he used to say in the play, I'm on the outside of the outside. You know, my country thinks I'm a criminal, my own community thinks I'm a traitor. And how does he sort of find home for himself in America, given that kind of a setup? And so that's sort of where the stories all kind of converged, and my central character, where he came from, and his journey, and his journey, you know, what he has to go through during the course of the play.
This central character, Chet, is a very interesting one. I gather that during the process, there was some events that happened in contemporary news concerning a certain Japanese-American lieutenant, or Aaron Watada.
Yeah, Lieutenant Aaron Watada.
Yeah. Could you talk a little bit about how that story influenced your process, and maybe other issues and things going on in the contemporary world that fed into your writing of this play?
Well, you know, as I worked with the question of the Nono boy, this whole thing with Lieutenant Aaron Watada, who was a Japanese-American, a lieutenant who refused deployment to Iraq. He said, I'll serve anywhere else, but I refuse to go to Iraq on the grounds that he believes it's unconstitutional. And so he is in the process of being court-martialed. I think most recently there was something like a mistrial, and I don't know if he's come up again. But what's interesting is that the Lieutenant Aaron Watada case, as it played out in, quote, the ethnic newspapers, Japanese-American community, has brought about sort of what I think is a similar response to the Nono boys, in that he is being viewed, not by all, but certainly by the military groups, the ones that were extraordinarily brave, the 442nd, by some of them as a traitor and as a coward. Lieutenant, Aaron Watada should serve. And what's interesting is, again, it's the same kind of thing. It's been a very divisive split in the community as to, he is an individual who embraces being Japanese-American, who chooses to refuse deployment on the grounds that it's not constitutional. He is inordinately bright and articulate and a poster boy for being sort of the U.S. soldier. But he believes, after talking to soldiers coming back, that it's wrong. And it's very similar to my central character, Chet. And as this went on in contemporary news, it fed into my character, in which the no boy issue became underscored more. It sort of became bolstered. And that's what happens as you write a play. You're writing it, and over a period of 3.5, 4 years, things happen to you in your personal life and the world around you that continue to sort of feed into the play. And so the no boy aspect, and I just gave him a speech, actually, a couple of days ago, where he says, because I really wanted to bring up the issue and make it relevant to contemporary times. He says, doesn't anybody care what happened? I mean, they took away our rights. Doesn't anybody care? Is the Constitution just a piece of paper that means nothing, that the president can sign another piece of paper, and then we lose our citizenship, and they can do whatever the hell they wanted to us? It's wrong. It was wrong then, it's wrong now, and I don't care what kind of questionnaire it is. I'll sign it no, you know, and I'll yell it at the president. I'll yell it at Roosevelt. I'll yell it at, you know, General DeWitt, Earl S. Warren, whoever. You know, it was wrong, and it matters because he says it has to matter, and it's, to me, it's, you know, the speech I gave him was in part also just drawn from what's happening, I think, in the country right now, in relationship to the war. Who is considered patriotic, who is considered a traitor. And the point, you know, of a play, to me, is that it isn't just a museum piece, that in fact it does have relevancy right now, and that it does kind of spark a certain amount of controversy in relationship to what goes on now. And so that's how things that are happening in, you know, in one's life feed into it. I mean, other things feed into it too. Like, you know, my wife and I have been trying to build this house in the Berkeley Hills for about 5 years, and so, you know, all of that kind of also kind of feeds into the play, even though it may not surface in the way that, you know, the character's building a house, but, you know, it may be something about money that comes up in the play, but it actually was, you know, is spawned from like our own financial struggles trying to build this house in the Berkeley Hills. But it also sort of shows you how real life intrudes into your work, and how you either can listen to it and put it into it or try to ignore it. And I usually choose to sort of put everything that's going on around me in the world, what I'm reading, what I find intellectually curious, into the work, no matter what the story is.
Mm-hmm. So let's turn our attention a little bit to these characters. You've created, is it 9, I think, altogether, characters that are all extremely different, from very different backgrounds, and you spoke just now about wanting to find an authentic voice for each of them and working from the inside out. Mm-hmm. So how do you go about creating specific voices for a Jewish-Russian character by way of Yokohama, for an African-American character, for all these different characters? I know that you worked with specific actors. Did they help at all? What happened? What was the process there?
Well, absolutely. In terms of the African-American characters, I wrote this piece initially for the ACT Core Company, and I thought it would be a great challenge to actually write a play for the Core Company. And the Core Company has 2 African-American actors, and so I had tailored two of the characters for Stephen Anthony Jones and Gregory Wallace, I believe his name is Gregory. And it's interesting that Gregory Wallace, an African-American man, was supposed to play Mr. Oji, who is an eccentric Japanese-American Nisei who likes Russian literature. And I thought it would be sort of an interesting thing to do, you know. And but after a while, we did a reading or two, and we realized that as good an actor as Gregory is, that was pushing his limits to play a Japanese-American Nisei guy in the late 40s.
Plus, he's a much older character. I imagined Oji to be older somewhat.
You know, he was originally, but this is sort of what happens in the course of writing the play and the course of of using various actors. He became younger. So now the actor, who's a Chinese-American actor, Francis Ju, who plays Mr. Oji, is more like a character in his mid to late 30s, eccentric, a career bachelor who's into Russian literature, and who fashions himself kind of patterned after the Japanese artists of the 30s and 40s. So he wears a beret, and he has his round sort of glasses. But getting back to the question about creating characters, for example, African-American characters, I'm always a bit cautious. In fact, I'd written another play called Yohen that was about an African-American GI and a Japanese wife that got married in post-war Japan. And I wrote that play 20 years ago, and I wouldn't do it for about 8 years or so because I just didn't feel comfortable about being a Japanese-American writing an African-American character. And you have to think about, too, like, this whole idea of political correctness, has both an upside and a very bad downside. And one of those is people tend to be very cautious and not want to try things like that. I eventually, through my relationship with Danny Glover, pulled it out of of my drawers and out of my drawer, sure, the drawer, desk drawer, and we read it. And Danny was instrumental in saying, you should let's do this. He said, let's just do this. But again, it was me working with some African-American actors, and I actually had it vetted by August Wilson, kind of read it and checked it out for me. And there's another fellow who wrote Soldier Story, Charles Fuller, took a look at it, because I wanted to make sure that, my bases were covered. But so this new play, what I did is, I feel comfortable writing the characters, but you're never sure. And one interesting thing happened was, Stephen Anthony Jones helped me a great deal with the African-American characters. We took it to Sundance, Carrie Perloff, myself, and several actors, and we brought in, when you go to Sundance, you bring some actors and also some are given to you. And I hadn't worked with the African-American man and the woman whom we teamed up with at Sundance. And both excellent actors, but people whom I didn't know. So we didn't have a working relationship. And so there were moments when we worked where, I could tell that the fellow in particular wasn't happy with his character, because I had him standing there while the Japanese-American character went on, and then finally he said, "Hey, Philip, you know what? I would not stand here and take that crap." The moment he opened his mouth, I would just say, "Stop." Oh, okay. And so it wasn't contentious, but what it was is that area of discomfort. And I think all of you know, racial politics are very tricky this day and age. And if you want to really start to address certain things, you have to go to that area of discomfort. And you have to go to that area where you may even have to go into this area beyond discomfort of being kind of slightly offensive to each other. As long as you're in a context of trust and saying, this is an art piece we are working on. We are working for the truth of the characters. And so at Sundance, I worked with two, in terms of the African-American characters, two generous actors who were willing to, with myself, kind of spar a bit to make sure that what we ended up with was a truthful character and a truthful relationship between the African-Americans and the Asian-American characters. And that it was one in which both were speaking truth to truth. One character wasn't just a sounding board for the other, that in fact it was truth talking to truth, right versus right. And that's a difficult thing to sort of construct, and it's difficult to sort of do if you want to get into what I call in-house versus out-house talk. There's all this sort of, in every community you have, what goes on inside the house in your own community versus outside of it. It's sort of like Charles Barkley is someone who on public television will say in-house stuff and embarrass other African-American athletes who are kind of trying to represent themselves in a good manner. So that's what I try to do, is to kind of work from the inside so that what is said is what is normally not spoken outside of that world. Because that, to me, is when you get into the kind of juicy stuff. And so that is an instance where the African-American characters were definitely elevated at Sundance. And it's only because I worked with these actors, and I continue to work with African-American actors who give me a lot of feedback on their characters. And women always do this to me, too. There was one workshop we did, an actress, African-American actress, Michelle Shade, just said to me, Philip, an African-American woman really, would protect her man's manhood. She wouldn't just let him kind of go out there, and there's this interracial romance that happens. This whole thing between black man, white woman, another African-American woman, and how this is all viewed, the sexual and political dynamics of that. And she said how she felt her character had to really stand up and try to protect her man. And so as a consequence, it became part of the storyline where the African-American woman will not tell Earl Worthington that, in fact, his wife, her sister, his wife, has actually left him already and has run off with another man. She doesn't tell him that because she's trying to protect his manhood. So those are things where I think if you're a smart playwright, you really take advantage of your very smart actors and your very smart director. And again, this is this thing of where it's always coming down to ego, at Sundance, in every rehearsal process. And this one, I like to be a part of a very generous workshop. And if you were in there, you would say, wow, it's pretty freewheeling. But my feeling is, in certain contexts, for example, you have 9 characters, 9 storylines that, all are trying to be sort of pieced together so that they all are introduced, they all intertwine, and by the end, they all resolve in some form or fashion. It's not an easy thing to do, because if you tweak one thing over here, then the whole structure sort of is affected and the balance is thrown off. So it's such a delicate architecture. So as we're in rehearsal process, I really rely on actors to kind of say at some point, you've tweaked something here, but then my character on this part of Act 2 no longer is in the right place. And so we have to pay attention to that. So in the rehearsal process, it's very democratic up to a point. In fact, I talked to Carrie recently. I said, I think it's gotten to a point where there's so much stuff I have to keep in my head that I need to sort of cull it down a bit and make it a little more specific, because the point is everything's in my head. And if I'm throwing stuff out and putting stuff in, whatever comes out or goes in has to stay part of this architectural plan that I have in my head, so that it always stays structurally sound. And so that's been an interesting process and a good one. And we're just in the stage now where I think we're at the end of our 2nd week, and I didn't think I'd be doing as much rewriting as I have. I've done a tremendous amount of rewriting, and we've actually reordered scenes, which normally if you're doing that, it means you're in trouble. It's what I call chasing the play. If you're chasing a play, trying to find its story, then, that's not a good thing. And I've gone through that, and it's really horrific, because it's where you can't find the story. You just have a bunch of characters and a bunch of plot points, but you can't find it. So what you do is you keep on writing different things, and you try to find the ending and make it end up right. That's simply hellish. That is awful. And I'm pretty careful now that by the time I go into rehearsals that the play is usually done. But what's interesting is I thought this play was done, but it's turning out to be quite plastic still, in the best possible sense. Literally to take a scene from Act 2 and put it into Act 1, we did that, and to just a lot of interesting things are still happening. But it's making the play better. In a very concrete way, and it feels very different. So everything is about making the play tighter, getting rid of any kind of excess stuff. You really have to kill your darlings, and that you have all this great dialogue that I wrote maybe 3.5 years ago that just has to get basically thrown and cut off and taken away, because in the end, it really is true. Less is more, and if you can make a scene sort of happen with less speaking, it's better. In fact, we just did one today where we now have the kind of whole play ending with, and we'll see, when you see the play, you'll see if we still have it, where we have Chet playing his horn, just playing his horn, kind of a bluesy jazz thing. And that's supposed to basically speak to where he is at that moment at the end of the play. And as we watched it, I thought, you know what? I've written some stuff that I think we cut before, which is, he used to say, simple things, I come into your house, you come into mine, trust, that's all, just a little trust. And I thought that would work really well, but then I sort of kind of brought it up, and everyone was saying, but no, that's, if the music seems to say it all. And I thought, well, that's right. If the music can say it without any words, then that's what we should go with. And so that's a moment where, hopefully, if you've lined everything up correctly, that at that moment that Chet pulls out his horn, after he's had this blowout with Earl and everyone, that he pulls out this horn, and it's the first time he plays, whatever comes out is what he feels at that moment, and sort of sums up where he is at the end of the play. And so that's what we're shooting for. That's what we tried today. And the tricky thing is, it's a bit sort of a stretch of reality. You ever have a character in theater or even in film sort of pick up a horn and play who's not a horn player? You know how it always looks, unless you do it right, it always looks phony. And I had originally scripted the play so that we wouldn't have that problem. I thought I'd come up with a clever sort of solution, and that is his love interest, Lillian, goes into this and gets the 78 and puts it on and plays it. And while she's listening to it, Chet has his horn for the first time and kind of holds it and fingers it, but doesn't actually play it. And yet we hear him actually playing 5 years earlier on a Lionel Hampton record. So it's a way of kind of hearing him and yet not having him actually mime playing. But we're going to try the mime playing. And so Anthony Brown, who's the composer, is going to get a horn player to sort of play something that is good, but it's also someone who hasn't played in a while, so it's a bit rusty. So that's kind of tricky, but it had to be that, because it couldn't be anything too complicated. He couldn't just come up with this extraordinary, riff that made everyone stand up and cheer. It has to be sort of kind of raggedy, but yet truthful, and yet speak to that moment and sum up everything that's happened in the course of the play. Wow. But that's Anthony Brown's problem, not mine.
So anyway, I guess we should open this out to everyone out here. I'm sure you've got some questions that you'd like to ask Philip, so I'm happy to take questions on the floor. Over there, in the red.
Can you explain again why the no boys were rejected by the Japanese community? I can understand if they said that they did not want to force if they answered no, that the Caucasian community would reject them, but I'm not sure why the Japanese community rejected them, because I felt like they were making a stand for the community.
I think what's happened is in the last 15 years or 20 years, as we've looked back on history and the community has looked back on it, it's able to look at these characters in a different light and through a different lens. And they are seen now as people who, in their own ways, made heroic choices. But at the time, again, I didn't live through it, but my sense is, in having talked to people, the 442 and 100th Battalion, those folks went out and they literally were killed in very high rates. And these were people who were your brothers, your uncles, your fathers. And so I think the sentiment was that, and I think by and large was true, is they were trying to prove that they deserved to be Americans, to prove to the country that we belonged here, that we didn't belong behind these barbed wire fences. And they did. They did that, and they paid with their blood. And I think that was sort of the general feeling of the community. Our brothers, our fathers, our uncles, our sons paid with their blood, literally, not figuratively, literally, so that we could be Americans and live our lives and get out of camp and just go about our ways. So I think it's because it was such a heightened state and so much like to do with life and death, that those who, and they were in a minority, who had signed no, were treated as if they had in fact kind of turned on their own people, that their brothers went off to war and died trying to prove that we were loyal. And here you did something which made us look disloyal. Here you did something which made us look bad. And so as a consequence of your bad behavior, maybe more boys had to die. Maybe we had to work even harder. But I think it was because of the extreme circumstance of the time, and the stakes were incredibly high, that you did have a community that looked at these men as if they had in fact turned against their own community and had worked against those who had served and died. And that was the case. I know it's still a problem now. I know I have a friend who is a no boy, and he talks about how even now, 60-something years later, there are people in the community who won't talk to him because he was a no boy. And but again, it's through the lens of the present-day politics, how we've begun to look at the events and study them, that the resistors from Heart Mountain, who were another group who on constitutional grounds contested serving. They refused to serve, as opposed to the no boys who signed no. The resistors actually went to federal prisons. They went to Leavenworth. They are now looked at and studied and interviewed in a much different light. even though in the community itself there is still strong feelings and divisiveness about how we should view, how they should be viewed. A lot of my research was pulled from the No-No Boys and Resistors was pulled from the Japanese American National Museum. My wife and I went down there, and they have on file a bunch of interviews with people, Frank Emmy, a variety of folks who were part of the Heart Mountain Resistors and also the No-No Boys. And these interviews were done by Frank Chin, a fellow named Frank Abe, and a few other folks. And they're all on file, and I used that to draw from almost to make sure I created real live characters. Hope that answers the question.
Who else wants to ask a question? Over there, yep.
In your research, were you able to compare and contrast the Italian American internment experience with the Japanese American? And if so, is there anything really poignant about their experience?
You know what? I have to admit, I haven't done as much research into that area because there were Germans also who went through the same thing, and no, I didn't. And that certainly is a story that should be looked into. Because I know in my early works I used to talk about a character would say, you know, why didn't they do this to the Germans and Italians? But at that time I wrote this plays, I wasn't aware of, you know, that the other things were going on in the country also. So I don't know a lot about that.
Yes.
Was there anyone or any group of people that you studied in particular for your sort of artsy Japanese American artist character, eccentricism?
No, but I feel like I sort of have it inside of me, my body, that I've actually played this type of character in one of my films where he wears very odd glasses and he has a bow tie and he fashions himself sort of as a bit of an intellectual, and he actually represents a kind of character that you do find in the community and in communities, someone who is sort of outside of it, marginalized, who is part of the community yet he's never fit in. He's a bachelor. His interests are very un-Japanese American, quote. He can't find relationships with a female. He's been introduced by the marriage sort of broker, and it doesn't work. But in fact, you know, I think his character, if he were in present day society, he'd be gay. And it's sort of interesting that, and in fact, the character whom I wrote it for, Gregory Wallace, is a gay actor. And it's sort of interesting. Francis Jew, who plays him now, is gay. But it is kind of true. You have a type of character who, in a particular point in history, had to sort of play out a different role. But if he were in present-day society, he would be, you know, gay and living life and going about his business. So that is sort of interesting about that character.
Yes, gentleman here.
Mr. Gotanda, do you think that with all the writing and examination of the relocation camp experience that has occurred in the last decade, et cetera, that the country has actually learned from the experience and what it has done to the extent that it wouldn't happen again? Not necessarily with Japanese Americans, but with other.
Like Arab Americans, Muslim. You know, I'd like to think I could say yes, but I would think not, in that though in fact there is more information out there and more people know about the internment camps than ever before, it certainly seems evident to me that at least into certain like individual cases, it's still going on, and that certainly after post 9/11, in relationship to Arab and Muslim Americans. Gee. But, my response would be, I don't think we have learned, unfortunately.
I think we have time for one more question. Yes.
Yeah, I think you picked a great subject, and I agree with that too. But it's because of the education of people. We have so much, what do I want to say? We have a great mixture like in San Francisco, but we also have lots of other misunderstandings, and like that article of Asian, we get everything. I mean, I'm glad you're doing this because I think so many people have no idea of what happened of the internment. So many young people and older people do things about it. protect the younger people, I guess. I'm so glad you're talking about this and bringing this to people, because we need to learn.
Well, you know what's interesting is the exhibit and the project that Ruth was talking about, and that's upstairs, which I participated in. What made it so moving was the idea that you had young San Francisco students who were not Japanese American, who were African American, who were a variety of folks, who were aware of the experience and in some way were making it part of their own life. Exactly what we're talking about, that how do you make something that happened 65 years ago relevant to young people today, so that there is something to be learned from it, that there is something that can be, taken from it. And that's what's so interesting about the exhibition. Is it called If They Came for Us Today, or am I saying it correctly? If They Came for Me Today, which is a great, great title. That accomplishes that, because that's the key to me, is how do you take an event that happened 65 years ago that was so important in terms of American history? That's the thing. It's such a critical moment where the Constitution was really tested. How do you keep it relevant in terms of its history to today, and make sure that in some way it's related to cases like the Aaron Watada case, or sort of what happens after post 9/11? That to me is the tricky thing. And how do you keep it alive? And that's what my hope is with the play, is that in some way it takes an incident, an event that happened, at least in my case, it's 1948, the story that I tell, and that it has relevancy to today in terms of how people can get along with each other in the most basic terms. Can ultimately people that from different backgrounds really get along when push comes to shove? When bottom lines are drawn, can you in fact make that bridge and get across that, quote, racial and cultural divide that is so deeply embedded in those of us who live in this particular generation? I feel like my generation, I've lived in a world that's so racialized that as much as intellectually I'd like to think of a society in which all of us could be, I can't see it in my own head. And when I look at younger folks and how they interact and how they go about their way and their life, I have hope. But certainly in my own sort of generation, my lifetime, my timeline, my lens of the country is very much a highly racialized one.
So thank you all for coming, and thanks very much to Philip.